Hello and welcome back. Today's video is a couple of days late, and I'll admit in retrospect that it's because I bit off more than I could chew, which is okay, because what I bit off was one of my favorite things to eat. Roast pork. This dish has a special place in my heart, which may have something to do with my Filipino heritage and our tradition of eating roasted whole suckling pig called lechon, which, to be clear, this is not. Instead, this is an unbelievably tender, slow-roasted pork shoulder with aptly, if that's a word, accompaniments. Naturally, it starts with this. A bone-in pork shoulder, roughly 3 pounds worth. In the interest of full disclosure, I bought this roast because it was on sale, but I didn't really have a plan what to do with it. Should it be roasted, braised, barbecued? I eventually decided that, until I figured it out, I'd do what I always do with big hunks of meat. Dry brine it and leave it in the fridge overnight. So I cut a crisscross pattern into the fat cap because it didn't have any skin and sprinkled the entire thing with salt. The next day, I decided that because there was no skin to turn into crispy crackling, I'd slow roast the beast, try to make it as tender as possible. So that meant putting it back into the fridge overnight, but this time rubbed down with some tasty ingredients. Starting with garlic, 5 cloves, a good amount, and ginger, enough to make about a tablespoon when minced up. Then a few sprigs of fresh thyme for a little herbaceousness. I chopped these up nicely, then added a little salt. Not too much, because the meat's already been salted. About a quarter cup of olive oil, then turned it into something like a rough paste. That looked like this. I intentionally left the garlic and ginger a little chunky, because I knew I'd wipe it off before I put it into the oven. Leaving it on, it would have just burned. Once it was ready, onto the meat it went. Then I covered the roast up in some plastic wrap and put it back in the fridge for the night. This is it the next day. You can tell by the change in lighting. Once again, salt has penetrated into the meat, this time bringing along some garlicky, gingery, thymy flavors with it. And now that the rub's done its job, step 1 was to clean it off. Step 2 was to prepare the cooking vessel. In this case, a baking dish large enough to hold the roast comfortably, on the bottom of which I put a large onion that I'd peeled and cut into 4 thick slices. The pork went on top of the onions, which acted like an all-natural rack, and the whole thing went into a 250F 120C oven for 6 hours. This is a roast at about the 3-hour mark. It was at about this point that I started thinking about the aptly accompaniments. First, potatoes. That's about 5 medium reds, which I left unpeeled and chopped into somewhat large chunks. No need to get fancy with them. Here's a roast at about the 4-hour mark. It's technically cooked, but it's not very pretty and not particularly tender. I pulled the meat out and discarded the onions. I threw the potatoes into the pan juices, then added about a half cup of unsweetened apple juice, which I cut with 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar for extra sharpness. I swished the potatoes around in the pool, laid the meat back on top, and put it back for an hour in the oven, which I also cranked up to 325F 160C. Next up were apples, specifically a pair of Granny Smiths and an ambrosia I already had at hand. I peeled them, then similar to the potatoes, I hacked them up and added them to the dish. Like so. In retrospect, I really should have cut the apples into bigger wedges, as a few pieces started turning a little mushy near the end, and the ones that held up were a little hard to distinguish from the potatoes. If you make this dish, keep that in mind. Anyway, once again the pork went on top, and back into the oven it went for another hour. And this is the pork after about 6 hours, plus an extra 5 minutes under the broiler to get that delicious deep brown color. As much as I wanted to tuck right into it, I had to let this rest properly, so I covered it with foil while I moved on to finishing everything else. Like the potatoes and apples, which weren't quite cooked yet, so I pulled them out of the baking dish and poured off the liquid to make gravy. Then I put the potatoes and apples back in and returned them to the oven to finish, at around 425F, about 220C, for another 15 to 20 minutes. While that finished up, I worked on the gravy. I started by skimming off as much fat off the surface as I could, then I put it on medium-high heat and added a half cup of chicken stock, then I brought it to a boil. I let it reduce by about half, then added a slurry of 1 teaspoon cornstarch mixed with a few tablespoons cold water. A little whisking thickened it up nicely, and it just needed a pinch of salt and a little black pepper to finish. Sorry about the shaky camera, by the way. I've learned it's impossible to whisk with one hand while holding a camera absolutely still in the other. I really have to invest in a good tripod. Questionable camera work aside, here's the finished dish, all plated up. You can't tell from the picture, but the meat turned out unbelievably tender. And not in a pulled pork, shreddy sort of way, because you could still slice the meat, but it offered no resistance whatsoever. My only regret was that the dish was monochromatic, and it really needed some pop. And to me, nothing adds more pop to a roast than a bright and tangy chimichurri. This was on day 4, by the way, which helps to explain why this uploads late. Anyway, that's a bunch of Italian parsley on a plate, plus a half teaspoon dry oregano, a couple of cloves finely chopped garlic, a chopped small shallot, a half teaspoon of chili flakes, and in a bowl, 2 teaspoons red wine vinegar, plus a splash of apple cider vinegar. You can replace the vinegar with fresh lemon juice, but I like the idea of continuing with the apple theme. Plus the vinegar added a little hint of sweetness. To make the sauce, I roughly chopped the parsley and mixed everything together with a little seasoning of salt and pepper. Normally I take the extra step of first pounding the dry ingredients to a rough paste in a mortar and pestle. The bruising that the parsley, garlic, and onions receive really seems to add something. But I forgot my mortar and pestle when we moved, and I haven't gotten around to buying a replacement just yet. So here we go, with a much more eye-catching plate number 2. For this, I sliced a few pieces of roast and put them in a hot pan with the potatoes and apples. This both reheated everything and added a little extra caramelization, which is always nice. A drizzle of chimichurri was the metaphorical icing on the cake. Now, considering this was basically leftovers, you're probably wondering how it ate. Truthfully, it was as good as the previous night. The pork was still tender and juicy, and the potatoes and apples were lightly crisped. Have I mentioned that I love roast pork? And that's it for this recipe. If you like this, or if you want to just say something, please leave a message in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.